Hey, what's up,
All right.
everybody? This is Matthew Everhard here. Thanks for checking into my YouTube channel. Hey, we have a great opportunity today to have sort of an interfaith dialogue, I suppose we could say, between Presbyterianism, yours truly, obviously, and Dr. Jordan Cooper here, who is here with us today to talk a little bit about Lutheranism. You probably already know who he is. I take it from the response that I got on Twitter when I posted the possibility of this discussion that many of you already either follow him or know who he is. But let me give you a brief introduction to Jordan Cooper, and then we'll say hi to him in just a moment here. He is a Lutheran minister, and he is a person who wears a number of hats. He is an ordained minister who serves currently, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Cooper, as the president of the American Lutheran Theological Seminary. You still hold that role?
I do. Yes.
And
Yes, I
he
do.
is an author. He's got a number of books. We're going to talk about a couple of them today. You probably know him, though, for his Just and Sinner podcast, which I think is maybe the thing that he's most well known for. You can listen to Just and Sinner both on an audio version of the podcast as well as on his YouTube channel. And Just and Sinner is also doing a number of publications, too, which we're also going to talk about as well. So, Dr. Cooper, thank you so much for being on the channel today. How are you doing, sir?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be here. I'm doing well. Doing well. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I noticed you you dressed up for the occasion. You always dress like that. You walk around the house like that all the time?
I do. I do. Yeah. Yeah, I dress up pretty much all the time. I mean, I don't wear a tie every day, but I regularly wear a tie. And if not, I pretty much always have a jacket on. But also if I'm on video and I don't wear a jacket, everybody comments. So I feel like now I have an obligation to do it for my viewers at this point.
Yeah, I think so. I think you definitely do. And the viewer will notice that I'm a little snazzied up today too. I don't normally wear a jacket when I sit here in the office and or make videos, but today I'm dressed up for the sake of our guest here. And I do have to say this too about the tease that I put on Twitter about the beard competition. And a lot of people, Jordan, if I can I call you Jordan or would you rather Dr.
Yeah,
Cooper?
no, that's yeah, yeah, yes, please call me
Okay.
Jordan. That's fine.
I teased
Yeah.
about this whole who's got the better beard thing, and people really got onto that. And I got to tell you, man, everybody found in your favor. And I think that the problem here is people forget about the categories of beardliness. It's kind of like a
Mm.
diamond, there's not just one thing, but it's cut and clarity and quality. And you obviously have the girth there today. You've out bearded me as far as length, but don't forget that there's also the coloration here, which I obviously have much more of, and then the quality of the lines and the fade in. So I think it's a little closer than some of the audience may have suggested earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's more than length. It's another thing I get comments on is when I trim my beard, people always comment, "No, don't trim your beard." No, I think having a beard that looks neat and nice is good. I think it's more than just the length, because you could kind of grow it out as long as you want and look kind of crazy if you don't
That's
take
right.
care of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all of a piece. Now tell us a little bit about your background here, because I'm interested in your work as both a minister and as a seminary professor. Are you teaching or administrating the seminary? Give us a little bit about what you're doing at American Lutheran Theological Seminary.
Yeah, yeah. So I can give you my general role. So my time is really split in terms of my full-time work, because I also do some college ministry on the side, and that's kind of a thing I do, a volunteer thing that I do because I really enjoy it. But so my time is divided between Justin Center, which is the podcast and publishing house, and we do some seminars as well, and then with the seminary. So my work with the seminary, I am the president. I've been in that position for about 2 years. I was doing full-time campus ministry until COVID at
Mm-hmm.
Cornell University. So I still do campus ministry at Cornell University, but not full time. And that ministry basically shut down because campus shut down, and it just became very difficult. At least I stayed connected to some extent, but not in a full time capacity. So it was after that I moved into doing Justice Center as a job, and then I moved into the seminary position. Now I've been teaching at the seminary for a while. We have an online seminary program that was basically designed for second career pastors. People who were in a job, really wanted to go to seminary, because of life circumstances, couldn't move their family to one of the Concordia seminaries in Fort Wayne, Indiana, or St. Louis, Missouri. And so this started as kind of an alternate route for people in those circumstances. The program just really grew, and it got to the point where we decided to move forward in the accreditation process. So that's largely my role now. It's not my only role with the seminary, but as president, I speak with potential students regularly. I'm constantly on Zoom calls and on the phone. I do advertising for the seminary, and represent the seminary at different events. But also I am heading up our moving through the accreditation process. So we just actually had our first in-person meeting with the accreditation agency that we're working with last week in St. Paul, Minnesota. So if anybody's in education, higher education, they know how rigorous and lengthy that process is. So it takes a good amount of time. But yeah, I've really enjoyed the seminary work. I also teach our doctrine courses. So I'm not just doing administrative things. I'm also teaching. I teach Doctrine 1, Doctrine 2, Lutheran Confessions 1, Lutheran Confessions 2, and then sometimes I'll fill in for some other courses as well.
Now, these are online courses, or are you teaching in person as of yet? So it does actually have in-person meetings, or no?
This is a complete online MDiv program.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do have some, times to get together in person. We have conferences, and then this summer we are launching an in-person intensive course for our MDiv students, because we're trying to get them together more than once a year, if we can. But this is designed to be a complete MDiv program online. We do everything through Zoom. So, and we've been doing that for a while. I think everybody does things on Zoom these days, but we try to replicate the classroom experience as much as we possibly can. I think, looking at, and I think schools have gotten better with online stuff at this point, but we really want to have that kind of interaction, teacher-student interaction that you have in an in-person program. So our online program is not just, you're not just like watching lectures and writing on them on your own. I mean, you're in a Zoom classroom. So we try to do a lot of back and forth as much as we can.
Now, am I right in thinking that this is a denominationally oriented seminary, or what kind of students would come here? Was it mostly Lutheran, exclusively Lutheran? And if so, tell us a little bit about the Lutheran alphabet soup of different branches within Lutheranism.
Yeah, sure. It can get a little confusing. I mean, just like Presbyterians too, or I guess any group can get a little complicated once you start getting into the alphabet soup there. So we are associated with the American Association of Lutheran Churches. So it is a denominational school. The American Association of Lutheran Churches we are in full fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. We are part of a larger body called the ILC, the International Lutheran Conferences, which kind of identifies all of those Lutheran church bodies throughout the world that have a shared confession of faith. So we are small. We have less than 70 congregations at this point. But we are also part of a much larger fellowship of churches beyond just us. And in terms of seminary students, we don't, it's not only students in our denomination. That the primary reason we exist is to train pastors for the AALC. But beyond that, we certainly have students from various other theological traditions. So we certainly welcome students from other perspectives. Obviously, our teaching is coming from our own denominational perspective, so we're going to be teaching as confessional Lutherans. But people are welcome to take courses that are not. And we actually have we have a Master of Arts in Theology program that was specifically designed for people who are not necessarily Lutherans and not looking into, a Lutheran pastorate. So that was kind of designed largely for people who, say, are pastors in churches where there is no, higher education required, such as like, some people in South America, for example.
Right.
And I say South America because they have the same time zone, so they can make our courses live a lot easier.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Some others can. We have a student in Wales right now, and that's kind of difficult for him. But so the AALC, though, just to give you a very brief overview of where we come from, we are essentially the remnants of what was the ALC, the American Lutheran Church. So when the ELCA formed, and the ELCA is the largest Lutheran church body in America, It is a very liberal church body. It's the equivalent of the PCUSA for Presbyterian listeners. They have some kind of official agreement with the PCUSA. And that merger occurred in the 1980s. When the ELCA was formed, it was a merger of basically 3 Lutheran church bodies that came together. The Lutheran Church in America, the American Lutheran Church, and then another church that broke off from the Missouri Synod, which was the American Evangelical Lutheran Church, I think is the name. It's hard to keep them all straight. But there were a number of churches in what was the American Lutheran Church that didn't want to be part of that merger because of the fact that the church body was not taking a strong stance on the inerrancy of Scripture. And these churches saw what was coming. And I think as you kind of look at the state of the ELCA now, it's pretty obvious that they were right. So they said, look, we don't want to be part of this merger. And they really wanted to just remain the ALC. They legally couldn't keep the name ALC. So they stuck an extra A in front of the name. So they became the AALC. So those are our roots.
Okay.
And then it was in the early, I'm forgetting the exact year, 2000s, where we officially declared fellowship with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let's come back to your kind of your personal history and maybe even a little bit of your testimony in just a moment. For anyone who may be tuning in for the first time, just want to say welcome. My name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship, PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh here in Western Pennsylvania. Love for you to come check us out in real life at some point, Gospel Fellowship, PCA. Want to mention too, my new book is called Souls, How Jesus Saves Sinners. It's out on paperback and on Audible. So if you like to listen to stuff while you drive or while you run or while you wash the dishes, whatever you do, for the glory of God, you can get Souls, How Jesus Saves Sinners on Audible. And Jordan, I want to pump up your book too. You have a number of books out available currently. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, your most recent book is called In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful. Is that your most recent book, or do you have something even sooner than that?
That is my most recent book. Yes. And here's I've got it right here. You can see it. This was my most recent book. I am currently finishing up, close to being finished with the book on the doctrine of God. And so I have a lengthy dogmatics project that I'm working on. I have 2 volumes in that. It's called The Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology, which is largely drawing from the Protestant scholastic sources of the 17th century and kind of bringing some of the categories and ideas there into a modern context. So I've released a prolegomena volume, which was my dissertation, and then I've released a volume on union with Christ, which was really just me jumping way ahead in the series because I just really wanted to write on union with Christ.
You wanted to be there. That's right. Yeah.
I mean, that's yeah. I mean, that was kind of the highlight to me of the whole series. So, and maybe I should have saved it for later. But now I've kind of gone back, and now I'm doing volume 2 in this series, which is on Doctrine of God. So that's what I'm working on right now. But
so how many volumes are going to come out eventually in that?
Yeah, I guess what's projected is 9 volumes.
Wow.
Yeah. So it'll be a lengthy project when that's done.
No kidding.
Yeah, I expect this to be kind of a life project.
Yeah.
So I probably will be releasing things between volumes like I did with that last book. Yeah, so I expect this to take decades before the whole thing is done. And you never know, I may add more volumes too.
Give us a little bit of slice of In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful. You have a little tidbit you want to share about what that's about, what you're arguing for there?
Yeah, sure. I guess this book really, the inspiration for this book was largely in my my dealings with college students, because I do a lot of college ministry. As I said, I was doing that full time, and I just encountered a lot of students who were engaged in cultural conversations, specifically surrounding Jordan Peterson, who I know we're probably going to mention at some point later too. But he really had a big impact on a lot of young men, especially, and continues to. And what I saw in college ministry was a lot of students that knew our culture was kind of a mess, but not necessarily being Christians themselves. And they started to have kind of an openness to Christian ideas. Some of those I've seen come to faith and get baptized. So the real motive for this book was kind of an apologetic motive. What I'm basically doing is tracing philosophy from a loss of classical philosophy into the modern world and modern philosophy. and dealing specifically with the transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty. So it's dealing with broader cultural issues, kind of where we've fallen from, and then it does engage in kind of what a Christian perspective and the Christian view of these three transcendentals is. It's not a heavy-handed apologetics book. I kind of wanted to write something that would be beneficial to the broader cultural conversation and kind of lead to maybe more specifically apologetic talks. So, for example, I'm going to be speaking on this book with the Cornell Political Union. They've invited me to come give a lecture on this, which is really, really cool. It opens up some avenues I think I wouldn't have if I was just writing narrowly theological material. So this was an attempt to kind of broaden out and discuss some broader cultural issues.
Okay, that's great. So here's what's kind of interesting between me and you. I think that there's some parallel lines that kind of overlap here, in the sense that I am primarily a pastor. I'm an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. We both have YouTube channels, so there's a lot of similarity. We both do some writing, some publishing, things like that. But one thing that's interesting is the kind of the opposite trajectories that you and I took theologically. So, for instance, I grew up as a Lutheran. I grew up in the ELCA, which you already identified as the most liberal branch of Lutheranism. And I was confirmed as a Lutheran. I was baptized prior to confirmation, obviously, as a Lutheran, and then found that to be somewhat dissatisfying. And I had a sort of a tremendous conversion experience at another congregation, and really never looked back and never came back into Lutheranism. So it has been years since I've been in a Lutheran church, other than to look at it architecturally, and just I kind of showed my kids where I grew up at one point. And then I came into Reformed theology by way of a study and conviction. But if I understand your testimony, you kind of went in the opposite direction. I'm not so sure about your childhood, but you were Reformed or Reformed-ish at one point before you came into Lutheranism. Am I wrong on that? Can you tell me a little bit about your theological trajectory?
Yeah, sure. So, I actually became a Lutheran while I was in the Pittsburgh area at Geneva College. So I'm very familiar with RPTS. I've been on campus there before and had a number of friends that went to RPTS. So I was baptized actually in a PCUSA church in New Jersey.
Okay.
And it was a conservative church. They eventually left PCUSA. So they were, they held pretty strongly to the Westminster standards.
Mm-hmm.
But that was when I was, I was an infant, and before my second birthday, my family moved to Massachusetts. So that's where I grew up. So I didn't grow up in that church.
Okay.
But my mother converted through 10th Presbyterian when James Boyce was there.
Yes, no kidding.
So very connected to some to the PCA, and that is really where I wanted to be for quite a while. But there was no really Reformed church in that area, so my family went to a Covenant church for quite a while, which has its roots in the Swedish Pietist movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was pretty young when we went there. Long story, but the pastor ended up basically preaching from the pulpit that the miracles of Jesus didn't actually happen. The youth pastor had a picture of his wife naked that was painted by someone in the church and sent out to everybody. It was a very, very strange experience. These are my earliest childhood memories of church. It was very weird. So my family was left after a lot of these strange things happened. And this guy eventually left the Covenant Church. I think he ended up in the UCC or something, because he was far to the left of where the Covenant Church was. But eventually then my parents were actually part of a church plant, which was an evangelical Presbyterian church plant in Western Massachusetts. Yes.
No kidding.
Yep.
That's the denomination I was originally ordained in before I moved over to the PCA.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. What was it? The women's ordination issue that caused you to leave the EPC?
Yes, that is the primary reason why I didn't want to remain in the EPC as a fellowship. Though I will say this, I try not to bash them. I had a lot of great relationships there They ordained me, many years of sweet ministry. It was that, and then I wanted to geographically be back closer to home. I had moved down to Florida for 11 years, and it was just
Okay.
too far away
Okay.
from family. So when we moved back north to be closer to family, I also wanted to move one notch to the right and realign with the PCA rather than the EPC.
Sure.
But yeah, that bothered me. That was an area of theological conviction for me that I thought the complementarian position would be better than the egalitarianism that the EPC had.
Yeah, because that's where I ended up as well. My dad was an elder at that church, and they were currently kind of having the debate. They were having the debate over women in ministry, and he presented to the presbytery on the issue in opposition to women's ordination. But so I think at that point with the women in ministry issue, I was like, I don't think I want to be in the EPC because of that. That was a significant enough issue for me of conviction, and so. I was pursuing the PCA. That's where, I mean, that kind of was the next most natural fit. So I went to Geneva College to study theology there. I was never convinced of the exclusive psalmist argumentation, so I couldn't go RPCNA. I respect those guys a lot, and I have good friends that are in the RPCNA. But
yep, me too.
Yeah, but I ended up, looking into the PCA. I kind of went back and forth between whether I wanted to pursue an MDiv or do a PhD. I've kind of bounced back and forth between pastoral ministry and academics. I've always wanted to do both, and I feel like at this point I kind of have done both. So initially I was looking at the Covenant Seminary, and then some theological issues with some professors there made me reconsider that. And I was looking at Westminster Philly at the time. And as I was doing that, I was confronted with some theological issues that while I was in college that eventually led me into the Lutheran Church. And I'll try to summarize this because I could go on and on about this, but I'd say there are mainly kind of two things. One is I started reading Luther.
Okay.
And a lot of Presbyterians like Luther. And Luther, I always had a lot of struggles with the issues of assurance. I mean, I honestly, they're just existential struggles, questions of doubt, knowing the nature of my sin, feeling a very profound understanding that I deserve God's wrath and punishment. I have a very kind of Luther-like conscience, I guess. And I'm sure someone could psychoanalyze me and give me a reason for that. But that is the reason why I think Luther really spoke to me when I started reading Luther, especially his Galatians commentary. And that was a text that was just a real balm to my soul. That text really led me to a place, I think, of peace with God. Not that I didn't have peace with God, but existential understanding of what that really meant. So
was it the whole of the commentary, or was it mostly the introduction, which is sort of the most famous part of it?
It was the whole thing.
Okay.
I read it multiple times. I remember like falling asleep in college with that book next to me in bed. Like I know the introduction is very well known, but it was really the whole text. So that was part of it. The other part was I was spending a lot of time reading the Church Fathers.
Okay.
And I think, going to college with a lot of Reformed guys, it was, every time we went to write like papers, we took a lot of the same classes. So we'd always be like, trading books or whatever. Like, what are you writing your paper about? And when we did subjects of when we were looking at books, to cite, it was like my roommates, my friends were always citing like John Owen or Jonathan Edwards, or largely the Puritan
good
authors.
stuff there, right? Yeah.
And I know that's the stuff that you like, of course. I mean, that's kind of your obviously heritage theologically. But for whatever reason, I just wasn't drawn to their writings as much. And I really was drawn to the Church Fathers.
Okay.
And I can't say like there was some like profound theological reason why that was the case. But for some reason, I found them more, edifying. So that's just kind of naturally where I went. I'd go to Augustine and John Chrysostom probably more than anybody else. So it was like, yeah, I could look at, something John Owen said about this passage in Matthew, but then I'd look at Augustine, and that, for whatever reason, just was more powerful to me. And I don't know.
Hmm.
So for whatever reason, that was the case. And it was really my thinking through what the church fathers said about the sacraments and then reading Luther on the sacraments that they were the guys I was really steeped in,
Okay.
starting to rethink a lot of my just views on those issues.
And then when you obviously started attending a Lutheran church, how did the whole aesthetic strike you in terms of worship services and maybe a little bit more elaborate worship setting, perhaps, than in a reformed, a little bit more of a simplistic worship service? Did you notice anything different there?
I mean, it was very different, right? So at the time in college, I was attending, um, it was College Hill RPCNA, which is in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, right near the campus there. And I know like Rich Gamble was preaching there for a while I was there, who's I know a very well-known guy within the RPCNA.
Yep.
So very strict, exclusive psalmist group.
Hmm.
So that was what I was doing weekly. You know, obviously when I was back home in Massachusetts, it was an EPC church that was a little more like kind of like an evangelical service,
Sure.
probably,
Sure. Yeah.
um, which I think is probably pretty typical of the EPC.
Very much so.
And so I went from that exclusive psalmist church to I checked out the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church in Beaver Falls, and I went with my roommates, and it was weird. It was weird. Like I wasn't like really impressed. I didn't go to that service and think, wow, that liturgy was beautiful.
Hmm.
I It was just different.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think I kind of came out of that not knowing really what to think.
Was there a
Um,
moment for you then where you said to yourself, this is my movement, this is my calling, these are my people? That initial sense of what am I doing here to I belong here. How did you get over that
hmm.
bridge?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it was theological as well as practical. So I had to just work through the theological arguments. So the first time I went to a Missouri Synod church, I wasn't convinced theologically of where they were at, but that was where I was curious about it. And I said, I want to actually look into this.
Hmm.
Um, so I, for a little bit, I was going back and forth between the two churches. And then I was reading the Lutheran Confessions, the Book of Concord. I started reading through Francis Pieper's Christian Dogmatics, which is like kind of the standard Missouri Synod dogmatics textbook. Um, you know, green hardcover volumes, and I had those right next to my green hardcover Charles Hodge volumes in college,
Hmm.
and I actually would read Hodge on a section and then I'd read Pieper's section on the same topic. And I went back and forth between the two and read through both sets. Um, so there was a lot of kind of back and forth because I'm like, I want to hear the Reformed arguments, I want to hear the Lutheran arguments. You know, I was going back and forth with churches. Um, there there was one I tell you, there was one moment which wasn't so much the Lutheran church, it was being at the Presbyterian church where all of a sudden I felt I can't be here anymore.
Okay. Okay. What was that?
Um, yeah, it was, and this is probably going to sound like I'm, you know, insulting the church, and I'm really not trying to do
That's
that
all right.
at
We
all.
could take
But
it. Lay it on us.
yeah, yeah,
What did we do wrong
uh,
this time?
yeah.
We have
No,
a long history of doing it wrong.
it was the sermon title was the gospel, and the pastor was preaching, and the cross was not mentioned once in the sermon.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
And it was about very much kind of the lordship of Christ. Christ is king. Um, you know, I'm sure he used that Abraham Kuyper quote that everybody uses. You know, there's not one square inch of the universe that the Lord Christ does not declare mine. Whatever that
Yes.
quote is exactly.
Hmm.
Um, not that I disagree with that quote by any means, but it was that moment when I realized that in the Lutheran church that I had been going to, Christ crucified for the forgiveness of sins was really at front and center. And I think that was the moment that it struck me that I just wasn't getting that centrally within the Reformed tradition.
Hmm.
And it was at that moment that I said I just don't think I could do this anymore.
Hmm. Okay. So how then did you move forward into ordination in the Lutheran Church? I'm a little bit interested in that as well. What does it look like to become an ordained Lutheran minister? Specifically, the one question I was thinking about earlier today is how do you in ordination approach the confessions of the church. As a Westminster subscribing Presbyterian here in the PCA, we have a whole concept of confessional subscriptionism, where we have to state our exceptions to the Westminster in writing, and if any, defend them before the presbytery, et cetera. Does Lutheranism have sort of an analogous process? And just take us through what Lutheran ordination looks like.
Yeah, sure. So I can give you the process. Essentially, it is generally required that you have a seminary degree. And I know Presbyterians are, my Reformed Baptist friends are very opposed to that as a necessity, but we do require, a seminary degree. But once you finish your education, you go before a board that we call the Clergy Commission, which is made up of both pastors and laity. So similar to like a Presbyterian examination, you're asked a bunch of questions. Questions about your life, questions about your theology, and this also includes filling out a packet of answers with doctrinal and practical questions. It's pretty extensive. It's a very extensive packet, and you have to answer then questions based on what you've done in that packet. So it's pending then approval of the Clergy Commission. Then you are put on our roster, and then you're eligible to receive a call. But in terms of confessional subscription, we don't have room for exceptions. So we are very strictly confessional. Those who call themselves confessional Lutherans, which would be those churches within the ILC, as well as like the Wisconsin Synod and some smaller groups as well. We don't allow our pastors to teach anything that's not in accord with our confessions. So we expect you to vow that you're going to teach according to those texts. So that's something that was different for me, coming from, looking into the PCA. And I know that, a lot of pastors I knew had exceptions, especially to the Sabbath, or it seemed like that was the big one.
And images of Christ, larger Catechism 109, relation to depictions of any of the three persons of the Trinity. Those are probably the two biggest exceptions we run into in the PCA.
Yeah, and then also, the Westminster Standards, have been amended in different, so I know that, like in an American context, some things are different.
Right.
There isn't as much flexibility in the Lutheran confessions. We were like, we're done in 1580. We've never added anything to it, and you have to affirm all of this. We're not changing it, and we're pretty like rigid, strict about our confessional subscription.
Now, just for the sake of clarity here, when you say your confessions, specifically, what documents are we talking about? Do you include the creeds of the more ancient church? Or are we simply talking about what do we have that we're subscribing to?
Yeah, sure. So we have the three ecumenical creeds, which we call the ecumenical creed. So two of them are really Western creeds, and the other one is a Westernized version of a creed that's the same. But we call them ecumenical creeds, and that's the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene, and then the Athanasian Creed. So we confess those three. So if you look at a book called the Book of Concord, which is a pretty hefty volume, which includes all of our confessions. So we start with those three ecumenical creeds. From there, we then have the Augsburg Confession. So the Augsburg Confession is really the foundational document for Lutheranism. Presented at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. So if you really want to get a good idea of what Lutherans believe and you want to read something concise, the Augsburg Confession is the best place to go. We then have the catechisms of Martin Luther. In the 1520s, he wrote the small and the large catechisms. Kind of similar to what you have with the Westminster shorter and larger catechism.
Yeah.
So and we have other documents, but just before I move on to what those are, all the confessional Lutherans hold to at least the ecumenical creeds, the Augsburg Confession, and the small catechism. Those are kind of our basic documents. So churches that were Lutheran outside of Germany generally had just those documents as their standard. But within the German Lutheran churches, there were other documents that were also accepted as part of our larger confessions.
Okay.
So you can be a Lutheran if you hold to just those, but we subscribe to these other documents. So along with those, we have, along with the Augsburg Confession and the catechisms, there is then the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, which is a defense of the Augsburg Confession written by Philip Melanchthon. We then have the Smalcald Articles, which was a confession that Martin Luther wrote at the end of his life. We have then the Treatise on the Power and Primacy of the Pope, which does confess the papacy as antichrist, and that's still in our confessions. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and Melanchthon wrote that work, and
Mm-hmm.
then we have the later documents, and these are written in the 1570s, that which are the Formula of Concord, and then the solid declaration of the Formula of Concord, which is just kind of a more concise version of the same text. But the Formula of Concord, it's going through 11 points of dispute that early Lutherans had.
Mm-hmm.
So this is further clarification of some of the issues that theologians who subscribe to the Augsburg Confession were in debate about, and then those were put forth in those documents in the Formula of Concord.
And so there are no exceptions permitted to any of these things. Is there something like, for us, we have what we call the presbytery floor exam, which is the most dreadful moment of the entire ordination process, where all of the presbyters of the area, they grill us for 2 or 3 hours or however long it goes. Publicly, they can ask us anything about the confessions or the Bible, our personal beliefs, church history, whatever. Do you have something like that, the floor exam kind of a moment?
Yeah, that's what we have with our clergy commission. So it's expected that you're
Okay.
in there to, a couple hours to sit there and be grilled.
Yeah. Now, shifting gears here a little bit, we're going to do something fun in just a moment. If you're willing to, I thought we'd have you do a little bit of a yo-yo trick. But before we do that, we're going to get back to that in just a moment here. You've written a book in which you looked back on Reformed theology, having come out of it into Lutheranism, and you set Lutheranism as over against Reformed theology, obviously arguing for the Lutheran position. What would you say, Jordan, if you could be honest, are some of the strengths of the Reformed views? And what then are some of their weaknesses that you critiqued in that book? So obviously there must be some overlap. If there's a Venn diagram between Lutheranism and conservative Presbyterianism, we certainly hold a lot in common. What would you say objectively then are some of our strengths? And then likewise, what would be some of our weaknesses?
Yeah, I think, that book, The Great Divide, was the name of that book. And that book was written it was just written first as a series of blog posts that I was writing just to get my personal thoughts out as I was wrestling with these issues. Eventually that became essays, and then it became a book. I mean, it obviously was highly edited from that, but that's how it started. So looking at it, asking me to give the strengths of the Reformed perspective, I would say there are no, I'm just kidding. There are things, being in the Reformed Church, there are things that I do miss, I will say. I think that the strength of the Reformed Church is that you have a very educated laity theologically. And within, I don't think any other tradition, I just don't think you have that same kind of, like in Reformed churches, you talk to lay people and they'd want to debate various theological points with you. And I've never encountered that to that extent in any other tradition. So I do think that the Reformed probably tend to be more theologically inclined in general. There maybe could be negative things about that too, but I do think that certainly is a strength. I mean, theologically, I would say the Reformed insistence on the authority of Scripture, the desire to be conformed to Scripture in every way possible, I think is admirable. I certainly, I don't hold to the regulative principle, for example, but I can at least respect the desire to be as biblical as possible, right? I certainly have a respect for the Reformed in trying to do that. And I think over against a lot of other, more broadly Protestant traditions, the Reformed tradition does actually have a tradition. It has an inherited self-conscious tradition. There is an intentionality of why you do the things you do, an intentionality of historical continuity, and confessional subscription. So I think, coming from my perspective, it's much easier to have a good, healthy dialogue and debate, with confessional traditions. Because it's I like when you kind of know where people stand. Know their history, and you feel like you can really discuss ideas once you have what you really believe nailed down.
How about some of our weaknesses then? I guess you kind of identified some earlier when you were talking about your shift from Reformed to Lutheran, but go ahead and just let us have it here. What are some things that maybe we're not self-aware of, or maybe even some historical debates that you think the Lutherans have the edge?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think Lutherans are right because I wrote a book on it and I
Hmm.
changed my my own views on these things. I would say, one is historical continuity. Like I certainly think the Reformed has more of a sense of historical continuity than a lot of other Protestant churches. Um, but I'll tell you one thing I really struggled with in terms of continuity was church structure,
Hmm.
and I really had to wrestle with this question. Um, and there was a RPCNA theologian I had a conversation with, and I won't name him, but he told me that if I was going to the Lutheran Church, I was living in sin because the Lutheran Church was not structured according to the biblical Presbyterian principles and not abiding by the regulative principle of worship.
Okay.
And at least he's blunt about what he believes. That's fine. But if he thinks that's right, that's fine. But that kind of thinking makes me question, well, what do you do with the whole history of the church? Like, I think when you're so dogmatic about a particular worship style and a particular church structure, that doesn't really show up in, I mean, we have bishops as early as the middle of the second century, and then it becomes pretty much universal within, the next 50 years. So, I mean, I just think that you have some difficult historical continuity questions. If you're going to take a strict stance and say that the Presbyterian system of government is the only valid form of church government, or the regulative principle of worship, it's the only valid form of worship. I just think that there are a lot of difficult questions about history that you have to wrestle with.
Hmm.
So that would be one for me. I think the another major question that I wrestled with um, was the sacraments, the Reformed view of the sacraments. I think that when you read the Westminster Confession, in some ways it tries to, and I saw this in, I see this still in conversations with a lot of the Reformed, is, you want to have a higher sacramental theology, but then also you have this doctrine of election, which I think kind of forces you not to have certainly a Lutheran sacramentology, because they don't really fit together. And some of this was thinking about the question, why is it that Reformed churches, though Calvin's view of, say, the Lord's Supper is, I think, a more of a kind of realist view than Zwingli's. Why is it that Zwingli's view kind of wins out, it seems, in practicality? So my conclusion was, I think that that Calvin tries to hold in tension some Lutheran ideas and some Zwinglian ideas, and ultimately they don't fit together. So that was part of it, and then ultimately, though, probably the most important thing for me is the issue of Christ and the atonement. I
Hmm.
mean, I think limited atonement is certainly something that I profoundly wrestled with, existentially, but also textually. And I think I came to the point that in wrestling with the issue of limited atonement, I felt like from a Reformed perspective, I was often explaining away the text. Like, there's always a way you can explain why the text means what you want it to mean. But I felt like I was often trying to kind of squeeze my interpretation into those texts.
Hmm.
So those are, I mean, there are plenty of other things, but those are maybe the kind of chief issues that I really at least wrestled with when I was going through this.
How much do you think um, theological cross-pollination is important to us? In other words, so as a Lutheran minister, are you reading Reformed people regularly? Some of the reformers, the Puritans, even some of the later Princetonian theologians. Are you reading these guys, or do you pretty much stay in the lane of Lutheran theologians? How much should we be reading from each other's traditions to be helpful?
Yeah, I don't only read Lutherans. I certainly don't. I don't even read primarily Lutherans, honestly. But I read pretty broadly. I think it's very helpful to have different perspectives. So I tend to read a lot of Reformed authors. I read a lot of Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic as well.
Hmm.
I just tend to think that it's better for us to see different perspectives on various things. And that doesn't mean just in a polemical context. I'm not saying that just, I read the Reformed guys just so I can argue with them. So I think especially when I say my own reading, when it comes to things like biblical theology, I gain a lot from the Reformed. So, I love Meredith Kline, for example. I've read a
Okay.
lot of Gerhardus Voss.
I was going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. But Gerhardus Voss largely borrows from Gustav Ehler, who was a German Lutheran theologian. So I think there is a bit of back and forth. I do like the old Princeton guys, especially on scripture, and I don't agree with all of their conclusions, but on some things I certainly like them. I read a lot of Peter Leithart. I know he's probably not the most favored person in the PCA, but I really do like Leithart a lot. I read a lot of Michael Horton, who I really like.
Cool.
So I don't know, from from a
You'd
Lutheran
actually
perspective.
probably fit in really
Yeah.
well at the White Horse Inn. Have they ever asked you to do anything with them?
I have done some writing of articles for Modern Reformation,
Oh,
but
that's right. You used,
yeah.
I used to write for Modern Reformation too. That was another connectivity
Yeah, I
between the
knew that
two
you
of
had
us.
done that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I've
We
done
have
a
all these
couple of
little
things.
parallel tracks, Jordan.
Sure,
I
yeah.
have to say though, having grown up Lutheran, I'm not sure that I ever really experienced what Lutheranism has to offer. For one thing,
Yeah,
I
I think
left the
that's
Lutheran
probably true.
church way too young. I had a saving experience of Christ in 8th grade. And from that moment on, I almost never went back to Lutheran church. I will say this, though, that some of my most profound early experiences with God were of two kinds. First, my parents saying daily evening bedtime prayers with me
Yeah.
every day, just saying my prayers. I just grew up being instructed that there was a God and that we were to pray. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep, etc. So I just kind of, I was raised in
Mm.
that. And then secondly, Jordan, I think you'll appreciate this. Some of my most memorable and very early conversations were with talking with my dear friend, who is now a seminary professor and a college professor at Cornerstone University, about the creeds, which were in the front of our Lutheran hymnal. In fact, I still
Yeah.
have my Lutheran hymnal right here on my shelf. And in the front of that hymnal, there are the great creeds of the faith, including the Athanasian Creed. And that one got us talking. I think we were, I don't know, 3rd grade maybe, but we were talking about the Trinity. And so my early formulations of who God is and what he's like came from the Lutheran Church. During confirmation, we had to learn, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. And so I was sort of drilled on these catechetical basics. But it being a liberal Lutheran church, part of the ELCA, I can't say that I ever heard the gospel there even once, which is funny because that's what you said you loved about the Lutheran church as over against your experiences in the PCA. You weren't hearing the cross being preached for whatever reason. I look back on that experience and I wonder, with our doctrine of effectual call, if I just wasn't hearing it, maybe it was being preached regularly.
Yeah.
But there was something about being removed from the Lutheran context, taken out of this massive, beautiful Gothic cathedral and put in a gym, where somebody preached the gospel to me. And all of a sudden, it just totally made sense. Christ pierced my heart and gave me the faith to repent and to believe. So it was a tremendous change for me. And so I looked back on the Lutheran experience and I thought, why didn't you give me Jesus? Where was the gospel in all of this? You told me the 10 Commandments, but you never told me that I needed Christ as a savior. And so for a while, I sort of resented that. I looked back on it as just so much religion, and that the less entrapments of religiosity, the better. The less vestments, the less liturgy, etc. Now, having matured, I've thought through some of those things again, and I think I have a more balanced and mature perspective on that. But for a while, I really resented it. I felt like I didn't get the gospel in the Lutheran Church. So it's interesting that you're hearing the cross preached is what really brought you into Lutheranism.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ELCA. I think obviously I don't know the particular pastor or that congregation, but if there really was no preaching of the gospel, that certainly wouldn't be a one-off situation in the ELCA.
Yeah.
I think probably most confessional Lutherans would say that you're certainly better off in a PCA church than you are in an ELCA church. I think, and to be clear, I know some ELCA pastors that are very faithful, men of God and preach the gospel and somehow survive in the ELCA, and I don't know how they do it, but
I loved my
bad.
pastors. In my view, being a little kid in elementary school, they must have been 120 years old. They were these aged saints, very revered for their character and for their lifestyle. would not fault them a bit in that sense, other than I didn't hear the gospel. And again, it could be because it wasn't my time, or my heart was dead to hearing it, or the Spirit had not yet effectually worked upon me. But I didn't hear it, and so I resented them for it. But now I've kind of come to peace with all that. Well, hey, let's do something fun. Do you want to, will you, Jordan Cooper, this day, will you pull out your yo-yo and prove it to us that you can do this? Because I didn't believe it at first. I have to be honest. I didn't believe it. I thought you were talking about some basic level, simple tricks. And then I saw a couple videos of you doing this, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this guy is the real thing. So let's do this here on my channel.
Yeah. All right, I can do it. I've taken my headphones off, so I won't be able to hear you. But
all right,
I'll try to get a good view here of the yo-yo.
All right, cool. All right, here he is, everybody. Dr. Jordan Cooper, the one and only, buttoning up the jacket for better dexterity. Wow. Look at that. That is amazing. Just in awe of that. I can't imagine how long he had to practice to be able to develop that. No mistakes either. At least I'm not seeing any mistakes. Don't exactly know what I'm looking for as far as mistakes, but man, that is complex. Wow. What in the world? Wow. Oh man, that is awesome. That is awesome. I cannot believe that. That was so incredibly complicated. I don't know exactly what I was looking at there. I didn't see any mistakes, though. If there were any, I don't know if I would know what I was looking for exactly, but that is world class, right? I mean, could you enter that into a world yo-yo competition and win prizes for that? I mean, that's way more than your beginner amateur type stuff there. That's world level, right?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't competed in a very long time at this point, but I competed in the World Yo-Yo Contest back in 2001. So I placed 11th overall when I was there.
Wow.
So I made it to finals and then messed up my routine during during finals. But hey, still made it to 11th place. So I felt pretty good about that. But that was the only year I ever went. I've won a bunch of contests back in 2000. Probably I think my first contest was 99. I was born in 87, so I was like 12. I mean, I was young. I did win the Mid-Atlantic Regional Contest one that was 2001 as well, and that at the time that was like the biggest contest on the at least in the Northeast. So that was probably the biggest contest that I won at the time, and I was mentioned in the New York Times for it, which was kind of wild. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I know this. I remember my aunt sent us a clipping of the New York Times, and they did some like in the sports section, which is funny because I'm a terrible athlete, but they had a listing of like winners of all these sports events throughout the year, and Mid-Atlantic Regional Yo-Yo Contest showed up there, so I was listed.
Now, we were joking earlier too about what's cooler, skateboarding or yo-yoing, and we'll have to let the viewer decide. But I imagine that in yo-yoing, it has this in common with skateboarding, that there are probably all these technical names for the tricks. There was probably some like kick flip to fakie or some axle grinds there. Or does yo-yoing have all kinds of technical terminologies for the maneuvers that you're doing there?
Oh, totally. Yeah. There are names for everything, and some of the names are completely nonsensical. Like one of the first maybe more advanced tricks that people learn is called skin the gerbil. Like I feel like a lot of the names are just very bizarre. But but yeah. I
don't know if we can say that on this channel.
Yeah, sorry if that's offensive to the gerbil enjoyers. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, hey, listen, I don't mean to take up your entire day, but there's two other things I want to talk to you about very quickly, and we'll just do kind of a lightning round here. So let's go back to theological reading here for just a moment. We were talking about cross-pollination there, reading from other traditions. You know, one thing that I've kind of struggled with in my life is the idea of being a generalist on one hand versus an expert on the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a person who reads regularly, let's talk some advice to some of the listeners out there.
Mhm.
Do you think it's more beneficial for a person to be a generalist and read all kinds of different things from all different strata of life, some history, some biblical literature, some biographies, some deep doctrinal stuff, even reading from other doctrinal traditions? Or is there any benefit to really drilling in on one particular doctrine or maybe even a
Yeah.
particular theologian and becoming a master of their works and some sort of being able to get your head into somebody else's head? What have you chosen to do in terms of your study? How do you decide what to read?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it depends on the person, because I think we're all very different, and people read differently. People read different amounts of texts too. Um, I will say sometimes when I see people wanting to read so broadly and be a generalist, it's so overwhelming, right?
Yeah,
Because you just can't know everything.
no,
You can't even know everything you kind of need to know. And
right.
this is what I realized going into the field of theology. I'm like, there are so many things that I feel like I need to know to do theology well. There's so many people I need to read, but I mean, it would take you a lifetime to get even anywhere close to being able to do that. So I think recognizing your human limitations is helpful. Um, it's much better to, I think, read carefully one, take like Augustine's City of God. Take some text that's really, or is De Trinitate, really intense text. It's much better to spend your time reading that one book and really
Mm-hmm.
delving in than reading like 10 other theology books quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably going to
Mm-hmm.
get more out of spending the time with the things that are worthwhile. So I do tend to think reading deeply is more important in a lot of ways than reading broadly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, if you are somebody who, say, is going to go into a scholarly field, of, say you're going to go into biblical studies and you want to specialize in, Paul's doctrine of justification. I use this as an example because sometimes the guys writing on Paul drive me crazy. Because if you're doing that, you got to also know enough historical theology to make sure that you're being accurate when you represent other people, say, interpreting Paul.
Mm-hmm.
This is just one example, but this is a frustration I have when reading a lot of the debates about the new perspective on Paul, is that these guys are so specialized in biblical studies and they're so specialized in, understanding Second Temple Judaism, that they haven't done the work in Luther. They haven't done the work on, well, any of the reformers, or the patristic sources, so that they kind of make these broad sweeping claims. So I would say you kind of have to have a balance. Like you have to find out what your specialty is and realize what you really want to focus on and become an expert in that thing. But don't be so narrow that you can't speak to other disciplines. Because, and I think this is probably more of a problem between systematics and biblical studies than anything else. But I see this really, really consistently between those two disciplines. There's not really conversation happening, and I think it's unfortunate and
Mm-hmm.
can be a
Mm-hmm.
detriment. So I know my answer is kind of balance, which maybe is not. I'm not giving you a very particular answer, but I feel like oftentimes balance is going to be really the answer to those kind of questions.
Yeah. For me, I've sort of chosen the route of the specialist and focusing in on Jonathan Edwards studies. And
Right.
I have got, I think being a generalist is very, very hard. And I respect people who are,
Yeah.
in some sense, the MDiv is a generalist degree because it gives you a little bit of everything. It gives you a little bit of Old Testament, a little bit of New Testament, a little bit of theology, a little bit of church
That's
history, a
true.
little bit of counseling, a little bit of preaching. It is so tremendously broad. And even the work of pastoral ministry is a generalist trade. In some sense, you have to be
Mm-hmm.
good at so many different things. And yet, in terms of my academic career, I can simply say that being a specialist on one particular theologian has led to far more opportunities
Yeah.
to write and to lecture and to teach on that particular topic, because it does make you somewhat different. It gives you
Yeah.
some foot in the door that publishers or other theologians, there's a desire there to do some dialogue with that. So that's one benefit to being a specialist. But then again, I feel so ignorant in so many areas. Like I know nothing about World War II, the Civil War. There's so much history that people refer to, and I I feel so sad about my own ignorance in a number of areas. And the sciences too is just another field. I was just talking to another pastor today about how seminary did not equip me to be a counselor as much as I wish I had skills in counseling. There's just so many areas of ignorance, but with only one life to live and being a finite individual, sometimes you just have to choose. And so I've just tried to really bore into Edwards. Hey, I want to let you go here because I know you have pressing times for other responsibilities, but let's talk Jordan Peterson here for just a second. The other Dr. Jordan online. I couldn't help but notice a couple months ago that he followed you on Twitter, which I thought was very, very cool. And it led me to wonder what happened there that he heard of you. I wonder if he stumbled upon some of your podcasts or some of your YouTube videos. Do you know how it is he came to be aware of what you're doing?
Yeah, that is a good question. That kind of came out of nowhere to me. I was very surprised. I don't know how aware he is of what I'm doing. I will say I did see a video of him maybe from a year or two ago, where he addressed some things about his statement that he made about whether he believes in God.
Okay.
And I do remember watching that and thinking, it sounds almost like because he's saying some people say this as a criticism. And like, it sounds almost like he watched the video I did, because it was almost word for word what I had said.
Interesting. Okay.
But also I was like, someone else very well could have said the same thing. So I didn't know that was the case.
It wasn't unique enough that it had to be from you,
right?
But he found you somehow. I'm looking at his Twitter right now.
Yeah.
He's got 3.5 million followers, but he only follows 579 people. So that's a pretty narrow. That's a pretty narrow follower list there, and you're one of those people. I found that was interesting. I've noticed you've tried to tweet him a couple times. Has he responded to anything that you've said yet?
Well, I will say I think probably my conversation with Jonathan Pajot was it. I mean, he certainly at least knew me from that, because Pajot was, a good friend of his. So I probably. But I also know that he is known to kind of look up what people are saying about him on YouTube. So and I probably so I assume that he maybe encountered me that way too. But I know I've tweeted at him. I haven't gotten a response publicly. I sent him a direct message once, and he did respond finally. And
cool.
But so he knows who I am. But I'm not going to be. I don't want to be one of those like annoying people that's like sending him DMs all the time, like, please respond.
No way.
I'm not going to do that.
I wouldn't do that either, man.
Yeah, no way.
So what do you think of his work? Do you have any opinions on what he's doing?
Yeah. So to be honest, most of my knowledge of Peterson and interest in him does come from like a lot of the ministry that I've done with people who are very influenced by him. So it really is largely the impact that he's had on young men, because a lot of my ministry, college students, young male college students, who are very impacted by him. And I've seen him try really get people to start taking the Bible seriously in some ways, who didn't take the Bible seriously before. So my experience in, say watching his videos is largely in, contexts that are more apologetic, like things that he's said that I know that people are watching that have led them to ask questions about God. So I can't say, I watch his podcast every week or listen to his podcast every week or, read everything he writes. I don't, but there are certain things that I've been very interested in that he's said, and largely that's driven by what people point me to, more like, I saw this interesting thing, you should watch this.
Yeah. I love his stuff on responsibility. I find his stuff on personality types very interesting, because again, that's kind of a weakness for me. Psychology in general. I would say that I think his weakest content is actually his biblical teaching content. I'm not really impressed by necessarily some of his perspectives on interpreting scripture. I think they're almost entirely influenced by psychology rather than any sort of informed biblical theology or anything like that. But I do have hopes that he seems to be driven to or drawn to the scriptures. And I do hope that the Lord is working in his life savingly and will, if he has not already, brought him to faith.
I think he would acknowledge as much in terms of his biblical content. I mean, he really is giving a kind of psychological interpretation, and I don't think he's I don't think he's pretending to be a theologian and doing
No.
those talks. Yeah.
But I just have a little bit of concern of people that love his other stuff, some of his
Yeah.
motivation and responsibility stuff, getting drawn into the biblical teaching and thinking that
Sure.
these are lectures of first importance when it comes to interpreting Genesis or Exodus or something like
Sure.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that very well may be the case. To be honest, I haven't encountered that in my own interaction with people. What a lot of people have. I think it's because of the similarity of our names. There are people who have accidentally looked up my name and found my videos because they were looking for Jordan Peterson videos.
Right, right.
And I get these emails every once in a while, people telling me that, which is just kind of a weird coincidence, I
Dr.
guess.
Jordan, you both have Dr. Jordan in your Twitter
But it's the
profile.
B as well, so it's we have the same middle initial. So, oh,
okay, yeah,
yeah. So that's why I mean I constantly get emails of people calling me Dr. Peterson, which is funny. But it's been pretty consistent that I've encountered people who have said to me, I watched Peterson stuff on scripture, and then I decided I wanted to really get in depth with scripture and started looking for other resources. So I have seen, and this may just be my experience, like I haven't seen a lot of kind of, maybe evangelicals going toward like, well, I'm going to look at his interpretive methods. I've more seen people who weren't really interested in the Bible starting with him and saying, oh, this guy takes the Bible seriously. Let me look more into this, and then finding theological resources.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel today. It was an amazing opportunity to get to talk to you in real life, I suppose, as real as a Zoom conference call can be. But thanks for taking the time to be with us today. I just want to remind everybody that Dr. Jordan Cooper has a great YouTube channel, as well as a very informative podcast called Just and Sinner. You can find that on pretty much any podcasting app. Just look up his name or look up Just and Sinner. Also, don't forget about his new book. It's called In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful, on the loss of transcendence and the decline of the West. We didn't even really get to talk about Revere Franklin Widener at all today, and I was going to ask you about that. So that only means, Jordan, that you're going to have to come on again sometime, and we're going to do part 2 on a later occasion. Would you be willing to come back on the channel again sometime in the future?
Sure, that sounds good. We can do some 19th century American Lutheran theologians. Which actually could be fun because Widener had a relationship with Charles Hodge. And Widener was a bit younger, but they had written back and forth at one point.
That is so cool. We're definitely going to have to do that again. Maybe we'll call these the Marburg colloquies or something like that. And every once in a while, I'll have you come on and we'll have some Reformed and Lutheran dialogue together. That would be great.
That sounds good.
You have anything you want to promote on the way out the door?
You can check out my website, justinsinner.org, if you want to see, all of the books and all sorts of things that we do. But you can pretty much find everything there.
All right, great. And I just want to remind everybody once again that my new book, Souls, How Jesus Saves Sinners, right here is available in paperback and on Audible. All right, thanks for checking in, everybody. Love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.